that's considered out of ordinary. So let's say someone doesn't get a perfect score on the SATs, right? That's like woo-woo, right? And then, you also have woo-woo if someone is really ill with cancer. So that's also blamed on ghosts, right? So it's sort of applied to anything that you want it to be applied to.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
So I wanted to start by having you sort of give us a summary of your book for people who haven't read it. But actually, this book has such a unique voice and is such an interesting experience. I think it's really best introduced by having you actually just read us a little excerpt from it. So maybe we could start by having you just read a couple pages from your book, and people can get a real sense and a flavor of what this book is all about.
For sure, yeah. So the Whoo-Whoo refers to Chinese ghosts, and the book is about my family, my crazy Chinese family. They don't believe mental illness exists, and they kind of blame everything on the supernatural. So I'm going to read a couple pages. Before my cousin's wedding, the family said that poor Auntie Beautiful One had gotten herself possessed. By that, I mean she had never been so loopy before. Sure, she had her moments of paralyzing sadness and ghoulish uncertainty, but didn't everybody? One day, she said her brain suddenly detached from her body, and her arms started swinging like a deranged weather vane. Then her foot tap, 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 a jazzy quick step, as she quaked like a mechanical mummy before doing a possessed person's pirouette. My brain can't control my body anymore, she sang when we saw her. She said that God was now chit-chatting exclusively with her floating cortex. For months, Beautiful One had been gnawing and sucking on the same Costco-sized bag of almonds before spitting them out, starving herself into a size smaller than zero, crooning that God wanted her to die, motherfuckers. Why couldn't she just die, die, die? I'm being killed, she screamed at us. I can't swallow anything. Hunched over her kitchen table, she spat out nutty puree. She was a thriving franchise queen, recently opening 3 new and different Vietnamese restaurants in and around Vancouver, but had dialed everyone to broadcast that all nourishment would kill us, and we'd better quit eating at once. Shut the fuck up, everyone in her family had said, which was our way of being supportive. Just eat, and you'll be okay. But I was horrified, because Auntie Beautiful One had once been the sanest relative I knew. Despite her moments of sadness, my aunt had always appeared mostly outgoing and normal, a role model who seemed cheerfully unhindered by ghosts. How could she have ended up this way, unable to control herself, like my mother and grandmother? I felt betrayed that she'd gone completely insane without consulting me. After all, we had trusted each other, liked each other enough to arrange annual shopping trips to Seattle when our families no longer had time to go camping. She had tried to be an older sister to me, if not a typical mother. I still can't believe that I ignored all her symptoms, but I had been willing to consider Beautiful One's escalating depression because it meant that my standard for normalcy wasn't as normal as I thought it was. But it was also not surprising that someone in my family wanted to kill herself. In our family, you had to be vigilant 24 hours a day because you could become possessed anytime, anywhere, particularly in a private bathroom. The Woo-Woo loved it there, my mother said. Showering was terrifically dangerous, so was taking too long on the toilet. Every kid in our family knew creepy crawlies could jump us when we were alone, which was why my mother insisted on chaperoning my siblings and me to the bathroom anytime she could, even as adults. Auntie Beautiful One, the littler cousins whispered, had violated a sacred spirit code. She'd hogged the bathroom in the hours it took to slather on her makeup and been accosted by a zealously vain Chinese ghost. It's not like I believed any of this crap, of course, I told myself. But being home was always like entering a parallel universe where certain rules had to be acknowledged and maintained. Lindsay, you should leave the door open when you pee, my mother said, sounding concerned. It's not safe anymore. The ghosts are acting up. No way, I snapped, no longer bothering to hide my irritation, but then doubting myself for arguing with her. I'm not leaving the door open. What about my privacy? Jesus Christ. Are you fucking insane? No, don't fucking answer that. Do you want me to come with you? My mother persisted, looking worried. The ghosts are scared of me. I ignored her and thought about poor Auntie Beautiful One in her kitchen with her humongous bag of nuts, and I wondered if she was doing okay. Thanks.
Thank you. So you may have all noticed the book is pretty profane. And that's something that really leapt off the page for me from the very first chapter, which you started by alluding to stereotypes about Chinese people and families as being docile, muted, agreeable. But in chapter 1, you immediately launch into this turbulent scene where your mom is screaming, "Fuck you" at your dad and throwing dishes at his head, and you're cowering under a table. And I feel like that is such a perfect scene that really sets the table for the rest of the book, and also a great place to start our conversation. But I wondered, the book is obviously very much about your life and mental illness in the context of your family. But it also feels like you were very purposefully presenting kind of an alternate perspective or narrative about how a Chinese Canadian family can be. Is that something that you were sort of trying to get across, or something that you were sort of intentionally playing up in your book, sort of presenting kind of a retort to the stereotype that you start the book off by talking about?
In some ways, I think subconsciously, I always knew that my family was different, and that in some ways this book is sort of a response to regular immigrant narratives.
Yeah.
So I thought that maybe the best way to get the reader to sort of see what was going on was to be like, this is my family, this is how it is, we're not like other people. And that I felt was a way of sort of like getting the reader to go on this like crazy adventure with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely a crazy adventure. So as Bob mentioned in the intro, I used to write about global health for The Star, and I wrote a lot of stories about mental health around the world. And it's not unusual for different cultures to have sort of different euphemisms for mental illness or superstitious beliefs. But I think this is the first time I've heard the term woo-woo. I was just curious, does this term exist only in the context of your family, or is it something that you've heard outside of the Wong household, or is it very much something that was invented
It
by...
was definitely something invented by my father.
Okay.
I think in Chinese, we don't really have a word for mental illness. There's nothing that says, this is depression, this is schizophrenia. Right. And so by blaming the ghosts, you're not quite sure how to say it in English, so you kind of resort to, what would a ghost say? Okay, a ghost would say woo-woo, right? And so the woo-woo sort of just came about from that. And then so everyone in our family kind of refers to anything they don't understand by woo-woo. Yeah.
I was wondering if there was a literary meaning, a literal meaning to the word, or if it was like woo. So
More
it's
like
definitely
woo,
the latter.
yeah.
Okay.
Halloween.
Yeah. And it's used in so many ways. Like it's a verb, it's a noun, it's an adjective. So give us some more examples of what would be considered woo-woo in your family.
So like anything that's considered out of ordinary. So let's say someone doesn't get a perfect score on the SATs, right? That's like woo-woo, right? And then, you also have woo-woo if someone is really ill with cancer. So that's also blamed on ghosts, right? So it's sort of applied to anything that you want it to be applied to. That's something that doesn't make sense to you or that's out of ordinary.
Okay. So the book is very much a take no prisoners look at your family. Intimate details about you, your mom, your dad, your siblings, your aunt, your grandmother, and mental health. So you don't shy away from excavating family, I would say, secrets maybe. That's a pretty brave thing to do in public, especially as a first-time author. I'm wondering, when did you decide that you wanted to draw from your family and your personal history as source material for your first book? And I don't even think you write much in the book about your relationship with books or wanting to become a writer per se. So I'm curious when, I guess, the genesis of this book came about.
So I actually just started, it's actually started at UBC when they're kind of like, well, write what you know. And I'm like, okay, I know my family. And from there, these character sketches sort of became the longer part of the book. But I don't think anyone ever writes a memoir for fun, or it's something you do out of necessity, like going to the dentist, right? So you have like toothache or something, and you kind of have to get it fixed, right? But in this case, maybe it's like some deep ache, in the soul, and you kind of have to like and examine it and put it on the page. And I think that's how I wrote this memoir.
It's one thing to write about it, I think, for school, and quite another to actually put it out there in the world. Did you have any reservations about that? Like, was that something you really had to steel yourself for and talk yourself into, or was it very natural and you just sort of immediately knew that this had to be out there in the world for everybody to see?
When I was writing it, I actually didn't think anyone would read it. I was really writing this book for me. And I think that's how I do all my writing. I don't really kind of think of an audience. I'm just like, okay, what is the type of book that I would read? And now I think I'm starting to kind of realize that, well, maybe more than 5 people are reading this book, and this is my family. And I mean, it's definitely something, though, I feel is really important to be able to talk about mental illness, because it's such a tabooed subject in Asian culture, as you know. Our culture tends to sort of shy away from talking about, depression or anxiety, and it just felt that it was something, very necessary and very, very now that I had to do.
As you mentioned, mental illness is incredibly stigmatized
For sure.
many cultures, but I feel like particularly so in Chinese cultures. And I think in many Chinese families, the sort of concept of saving face, which is sort of maintaining dignity or a sense of respect or honor and image, is incredibly fundamental. And I think for a lot of non-Chinese people, they don't totally understand or appreciate the extent to which face is so important to a Chinese person and a Chinese family. And I feel like this is perhaps true of your family. I sort of gleaned it in part from certain scenes here and there. For example, your aunt at one point has a psychotic breakdown, and she ends up threatening to jump off the Ironworkers Bridge in Vancouver on Canada Day. And she holds up traffic for 7 to 8 hours and pisses off an entire city. And your dad, you're in Paris at the time, right? And your dad emails you and he's like, don't tell anybody that was your aunt. And clearly there's this sense of not airing family's dirty laundry or what have you. And then you go and write a book about all of this. And the whole time I'm reading your book, I'm just imagining if I were to write a book about my family and how my parents would react, and I'm just sort of dying to know how your mom and dad felt about the prospect of you putting all of their woo-woo out there for the world to see.
You used it correctly. That's great. The woo-woo. So with our culture, family secrets, you don't talk about anything that is considered shameful. So when I got an advance from Arsenal, I told my parents, and they kind of, pretended it wasn't happening. And they made fun of me because it was a very small advance.
And that's also classic Chinese parents. Right? Why'd you get the bigger advance from the top publisher?
I know, right? And then they were like, why isn't it a bigger publisher? Why don't they want you, right? And I'm like, well, I don't know. And so finally, when I was nominated for the Hillary Weston, they saw the number sign, right? And they were like, oh, okay, so are you going to win or not? Who are your competitors? And I was like, I don't know these things, right? So after the ceremony, of course, I didn't win, so we didn't talk about it. We just pretended it wasn't happening or it hadn't happened. So I think this is what's going on with the book. I'm sure my parents have seen the interviews. I'm sure, they're aware of, I mean, they know of the book, but they haven't read it yet. And my brother recently told me, he's an aspiring writer. He actually went to J school at UBC, and he said to me, you know, Lindsay, they actually put it on hold at the library. You know, they're number 10, right? They're just waiting for you. I'm like, oh, okay.
You haven't sent them a free copy?
No, I don't think I even have free copies.
Oh.
But so I'm like, oh, they're gonna read it, and he's like, yeah, right. I'm like, okay, but they don't want to buy it. You know, it's like I think the price is, I don't know how much, $19.95 in Canada. You know, it's
That's too much.
It's too much money,
yeah.
right? With tax and everything. Right?
Not for you guys though. It's for sale in the corner.
Yeah.
So they have not read it yet.
They have not read it.
Oh my goodness. So how do you think they're gonna react?
We might have a very interesting conversation, but I'm thinking that we're just gonna ignore it. We're just gonna pretend, you know, the woo-woo does not exist. Nothing is wrong with our family. There's no book, right? And we'll just continue on and just until the next book happens, and then we'll also pretend it's not happening.
Wow, that's incredible. I kind of wish we were having this conversation after they read the book, because I'm just really dying to know how they're going to react. So I'm guessing you didn't run anything past them beforehand, or was there any kind of...
With my family, if there's any acknowledgement of anything sort of like serious or, you know, emotional or something that's like uncomfortable, you know, it's just, no, we can't talk about it. Everyone just leaves the room, you know, like silence. And so that's kind of how, you know, our family reacts to things.
But they know what it's about.
They do know it's about them. So if I said, you know, Mom, Dad, I want to write a book about you, and my mom would kind of look at me, and she might just walk away, right? And she'll just pretend I did not say it. So I mean, talking to them would be very, very difficult.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to email me after they read it and tell me.
Yeah. But there is an Audible version, so maybe they'll listen to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was going to ask you if there was anything your parents wanted kept out of the book, but I guess that's now a question I'll just cross off my list. But I was wondering if there was anything that you struggled with putting out there, because you really do get, you know, it's a no-holds-barred look at your family and yourself. You get, you know, you don't hold back from describing some of the uglier aspects of your own childhood, or sort of, you know, the kind of person you were growing up, or some of the uglier thoughts that might have crossed your mind. I'm just wondering if there are any no-go zones for you, or something you really struggled to put in there that felt really vulnerable to put on the page in print.
For me, I feel like nothing is like, there's nothing, I think, too much information. I grew up in, you know, the age of Facebook, you know, Twitter, so everything goes. The problem with this book is that we had too much material, so we had to sort of condense. And I mean, there was a whole chapter about my father's family and how they grew up in the projects of Manhattan's Lower East Side. And so, you know, because of time, because of neurochronology, we have to like take out another like 30 pages. And there were too many jokes, my agent said. So she made me go through, and she was like, you gotta, you know, are you writing a memoir or a joke book? And I said, well, I'm writing a memoir. And she's like, cut 25% of the jokes. So I went through and I was like, cross this out, cross that out. And now you have this, you know, this very small book.
Digestible.
Yes, digestible for sure.
The sequel should be just the jokes that you
Yes.
cut.
Yeah, I could write a joke book.
But you know, this book is, as we've mentioned, delightfully profane and like incredibly sarcastic and funny and unapologetically non-PC, I would say, at parts. I just want to pay a quick second to paying tribute to some of the memorable nicknames that characters have in your book. Like, nobody is like Jane or Bob. Like, everybody has an interesting name. Your mom is Quiet Snow, which is her Chinese name. You're Talented One.
Yeah.
True.
Oh.
But also there's just nicknames given to funny, quirky characters. There's a Chinese marijuana-growing woman on your street who's known as Lesser Michael Jackson because she has badly bleached her face. And her daughter is called Pizza Head because she has some kind of skin condition where her scalp is scabby and patchy. You have an Uncle E.T. who survived polio and has deformities. And then you have a friend and classmate who you call Wheelchair Wobbin, because her name is actually Robin, but she has like a speech impediment. So she is known as Wobbin. So you really don't shy from this, and you really don't shy from using humor, I think, as a strategy and as like a medium through which to tackle what's really actually very serious and tragic subject matter. I'm wondering, in a different writer's hands, this book could have taken on a very serious tone. It's kind of like a tragic comedy, like it could have skewed more to the sort of tragedy, I think. And I'm wondering if using humor in this way was like a conscious decision for you, or if it's just sort of the natural way that you would write a book like this.
I think a little bit of both. I mean, I've always used humor as like a coping mechanism. So if something really terrible happens, right, you have to be able to laugh at yourself, right? I think in certain circumstances. And in reference to the names, I don't know about you, but my parents have always given my friends nicknames.
Yeah.
So they'll meet someone and be like, oh, that one has a crooked mouth, or that one's gay, so that one is funny looking, and they have like all these weird names for certain people, and that becomes their nickname. Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing in my household too. It's a very non-PC
Exactly.
space. But that hardly gets revealed to the outside world. So it felt very honest, because that's also kind of how my parents would talk about themselves. They would be very sort of honest, brutally honest, and describe themselves, but also anyone who they might encounter. So yeah, I thought that was very interesting. So I'm wondering, so your parents haven't read it, your brother has read it?
He hasn't.
Okay.
I asked him, like, are you going to read it? And he's like, maybe, but you know what? I don't think you're like a really good writer. So just so you know. Well, he actually said, I don't think you're a really shitty writer. I think you're a shitty writer. I'm like, thanks, So.
But now he's trying to be a writer, right?
He went to J school, and
Right.
he's working on a manuscript. And I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll compare. We'll
you'll
beat each
jostle.
other out. Yeah.
I love that his Chinese name is Make Lots of Money.
I know, right?
And he wants to be a writer.
I know. Yeah.
So your family crazily hasn't read this book yet, but I'm wondering what kind of reception you've received from Chinese readers in Chinese community. Have you heard much feedback from those types of readers?
I actually haven't, but I did have one lady, an older lady, come up to me, and she was like, she kind of thanked me for writing this book, because she said this is such a tabooed subject, and you were really brave, and I was really touched by that. But other than that, I'm really curious about what people think. And
Have you done any events geared at Chinese community and audiences yet?
I haven't.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
It would be really, really cool to see.
So Bob touched on this in his intro, but this book was rejected 14 times. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is my mic cutting out a bit? No, it's good. So I'd love to talk to you about the process of getting this book published. First of all, how many drafts did you go through?
So many. I don't even remember how many.
Right.
As a student in a program, you rewrite, and then when you get your agent, you rewrite, and then when you get more rejections, you rewrite. So I feel like I've been rewriting this for 10 years. The process was really difficult, but luckily I've always been a very resilient person. So, if someone says no, and I'm like, why not? I'm going to do it again. I'm the type of person who will just keep going.
Yeah.
And so I never stop.
And 14, that's an accurate tally of the...
I think I've counted everything correctly.
Yeah. So Bob mentioned some of the reasons that were given to you. What were they again? It was
too niche, too weird, and that's sort of saying your story is not white, so it's not accessible to readers, and that's always a hard thing to hear, right? Because it's it is your personal story, and then there were sometimes people were saying you should be writing Battle Hymn of a Tiger Mom. That one is universal. Everyone can relate to this, but yours can't. But I'm like, well, it's about mental illness. It's about family, so why not, right?
Right. Too niche is pretty coded.
It is,
way of saying, Were any of those publishers people of color or racialized people that responded to you?
I actually don't know, because when my agent sent me back the rejection, she never puts the names, right? So I think she's scared, like we'll run into each other at an industry event and I'll remember, because memoirists remember forever.
Right. So how did you finally get this book published? Tell us about that.
So after we tried the bigger publishers, I ended up trying some smaller houses, and I think I got like 5 offers, smaller places, and I was really excited. And Arsenal was perfect. They publish a lot of diverse books, and they're wonderful, and they really supported this book and my vision, and they just completely got it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you don't really write with an audience in mind. Your audience is yourself. But I often find that when I'm writing about Chinese community or any sort of visible minority communities, I find that I'm always thinking of 2 audiences, the sort of the audience from the community I'm writing about, who will understand a lot of references, and then I'm also writing for the audience that might be primarily white or not from that community.
Right.
And I always don't really know how far to go in terms of translating some of these things and making it a book that will be accessible to all. Is that something you had to go through with your book or with your editors when they read your book? Did you have to sort of put in any sort of extra translational sort of explanation to sort of get some of this stuff across to an audience that might be totally unfamiliar with the way Chinese families talk and operate and think?
Yeah, I remember having to brushstroke some things. I didn't want to go too much because I felt that would ruin the narrative flow. So, for weddings, right, I'll explain like, okay, we have a pig. We always have like a 300-pound pig for weddings, funerals, and births, right? And I think a non-Chinese audience might not necessarily get that, right? So I had to go through and explain that, the red packets, sort of, minor things.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's something necessary sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about how your book was treated as a niche book, and that obviously worked against you, although ultimately you prevailed. But do you see any, maybe you would qualify certain disadvantages to trying to become published as a Chinese Canadian writer.
Oh, for sure.
But are there any advantages, do you think, or that you've experienced already?
I don't think there are any advantages, honestly. I think it's harder. Like, I have people coming up to me, especially, white writers. I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Toronto, and someone said to me, you're so lucky, you're Chinese. That means you're gonna have like such an easier time getting your story out there. And I'm like, no, that's not gonna happen. And yeah, I think people think you do, but it's more of, unless you have to be able to fit a certain minority myth. So if you are writing a story that people can really identify with, and as an Asian female, they kind of expect you to be really soft and muted, especially in your writing. I'm not. Otherwise, their publishers feel like they can't really relate to it, and they feel like people won't buy the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So you do have a short epilogue at the end of your book where you provide updates on everybody. But maybe for people who haven't read the books, maybe you could just talk about your mom, your aunt, and your popo, which is your grandmother on your mom's side, and describe sort of the mental health issues that they struggle with in the book. And I'm also curious as to how they're doing today.
Yeah, so my grandmother has paranoid schizophrenia. She was the only one in our family who has been diagnosed. Everyone else sort of suffers in some sort of way from depression or anxiety, but it's not really spoken about, and they won't get help. They don't believe in therapy, and whenever something happens and someone's upset, we just pretend it's not happening. So in this book, whenever someone is upset throwing dishes, the other person will just walk away, and no one will say anything, and that's sort of like how our family copes with it, or we just blame it on a ghost. There are times when there is a funeral, my mom would be like, ghosts are chasing us, so we would camp outside at Walmart. We just go on a vacation because ghosts are apparently attracted to food, and there's a lot of food at Walmart. So we would just stay there for 2 weeks and be like, we're safe now. The ghosts aren't, going to get us, and everyone's going to be happy, and we're going to live in this fantasy fairy tale land. And so sort of things like that, I think, are what have made our family still believe in the woo-woo, and I don't think we're ever going to really discuss mental illness.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your grandma's the only one who's had a diagnosis, but is she receiving treatment these days? Because I know she kind of goes on and off for
It's
medication.
the same.
It's the same.
It's the same, yeah.
And your aunt, she did have the high-profile suicide attempt. What year was that?
2008.
Yeah. How's she doing now?
I think she is well, and I hope and that all my family is well from everything, but I can't really speak to what she's doing now.
That episode with your aunt is a real turning point in the book and for you. Can you talk about why that represented such a shift for you and why you felt that episode so deeply?
So I think when you grow up in a really close-knit Chinese family, you don't realize how sometimes different you are from other people. So I grew up sort of isolated in the suburb, you'd hang out with your cousins, and then suddenly having this very public incident happen to you sort of makes you realize that, wait, this is real. This is happening, even though no one is talking about it, but newspapers are talking about it. This is kind of important. I should sort of follow up on this. And that, I think, was the turning point when the private suddenly became very public for me.
It kind of punctured the reality that you were living in?
Exactly.
Right. And I think you also wrote about how you always perceived your aunt to be the one who was successful and who had her stuff together.
Yeah.
And did it kind of dissolve that illusion, I guess, for you a little bit too? You related to her. Yeah,
in some ways, because you grow up with who you see, and for me, the woo-woo was my grandmother who stayed home, and she never went outside. It was my mother who mostly stayed indoors. And then having to see someone who seemed so functional have some sort of, this very public incident was just heartbreaking for me and very, very, I guess, real in that way.
So you had your own encounter with the woo-woo when you were pursuing your MFA at Columbia. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So when I moved to New York from Vancouver, I started, as soon as I landed, I guess in a couple days, I started to have this weird vertigo where I'd spin and I'd have all this nausea and these kind of very weird visual and auditory hallucinations. And I was like, what is wrong with me? Am I having a psychotic breakdown? Am I going to turn out like my mother, which is one of my greatest fears? And so when I had a neurologist diagnose me, and he gave me, he said I had migraine-associated vertigo, I was really relieved because it wasn't, it wasn't schizophrenia, it was a migraine. Yeah. And so that was, I guess, my own, form of woo-woo.
So what was your understanding of mental illness over the years? Obviously, when you were younger, you really believed in woo-woo. Tell us about, I guess, your evolving understanding of mental health and mental illnesses.
I think growing up, I definitely believed it was a curse. It was supernatural. There was no explanation. And just sort of, moving in the world, moving around, going to school, meeting other people, and just sort of understanding it's the chemicals in your brain. It's like any physical illness, right? And it's something that needs to be treated or addressed. Otherwise, you have generations and generations of people not talking about their problems and pretending, mental illness doesn't exist. And that this is what happens to people who, especially family members, who don't talk about the woo-woo.
So was it a gradual understanding for you, or was there a moment where your understanding of mental illness went through a dramatic shift in terms of switching from thinking of it as a supernatural force to understanding it as a chemical imbalance or a disease?
I think it was very, very gradual. I think, you sort of grow up and then you sort of question, like, what is this? Like, why is my mother like this? But, as a young child, you're kind of like, oh, mom's not feeling well. And I think that was sort of, my moving point through the whole book.
So how do you define woo-woo for yourself now?
Woo-woo for myself, it kind of refers, when I'm with my family, I'll use the word woo-woo. So if I'm not feeling well or something, someone's acting up, I'm like, yeah, they're totally woo-woo or something. With my friends, I don't use the word woo. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not feeling well today. So there is that split of self, your family self, and then your outside persona, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your family's views on mental health have not
They
budged.
have not changed. You're not going to change, I think, unfortunately.
Have you ever attempted having conversations with them to sort of explain what you've come to understand about mental illness, or is that conversation impossible?
That conversation would probably be impossible. If you say something to my mother, she'll look at you and she'll not respond. She'll probably just walk away. Right. And that's how we deal with things in our family.
Right. So how has life changed for you since this book has come out?
I'm busier. I've been doing a lot of interviews. I've been meeting a lot of people, but I don't think life has really changed that much.
So
I did get recognized at a Starbucks.
Really?
Yeah, in Vancouver.
What did they say?
They're like, oh, but are you a writer by any chance? And I was like, no, you have the wrong person. And I ran away. I was like so embarrassed.
Oh my gosh. That was your one moment.
That was my
like,
one moment.
Yes,
I was like,
no
no
autographs.
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
So what are you up to now? I think back in the green room, you told me you're currently living in a halfway house?
Yeah, no, I'm doing a residency at the John Howard Society and the Vancouver Community Arts Council. So it's sort of like an inclusive live-in residency. So I know it's not politically correct, but I tell people I've gone from like a mental hospital to a halfway house. So I'm sort of just, you live there, you write there, you teach there, which is sort of really interesting. So I have lots of material if I ever want to write another memoir. But I don't know if I want to because memoirs are hard.
I was going to say, it sounds like grist for another book.
For sure, yeah.
Is there anything left from your family life, your personal history, that you feel like you haven't had a chance to mine in this book that you might pursue for a future follow-up memoir?
I mean, my family doesn't really believe in mental illness, so maybe something will happen again. I cut a lot of my father's family from this book. I mean, they could be another book, right? There's always exploration. So I'm like, family, watch out, behave, I'll write about you. So I could totally do that. But I do have a YA book that is coming out in 2020.
A young adult book.
A young adult book.
What's that one about?
That one is about a Chinese girl who sort of fails everything. So her family just sends her back to Beijing, and they're like, stay there, don't shame us. So I guess I write a lot about, shame and, being able to face it or not face it within like a family context.
So I'm just curious too, your book, you do write about other people that you encounter in your life. You don't name them. They all have fun nicknames. Has anyone who's in your book read your book and reached out to you afterwards?
No, they haven't.
You've really gotten off scot-free.
I don't
So
know.
far.
But I'm really curious if they'll recognize themselves or if they'll bother to read it. Because I don't know. I don't know if my friends have read this book.
Everyone else in the world has read it except for your actual friends and family.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the dream, actually, of when you write a memoir, because the scariest part is about worrying maybe how the people in your life might react to being depicted in a book through your eyes.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to move on to questions from you lovely people shortly, and I believe there's a microphone down the center, and perhaps also there will be a microphone floating. So I think you can just line up if you would like to ask Lindsay any questions. But maybe we'll just wrap up by, you did mention you're publishing a YA book. Do you know when that's coming out yet?
July 2020.
Okay, and what's it called?
It's the title right now is The Summer I Learned Chinese.
And what's it about?
And it's about a Chinese girl who gets sent back to Beijing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it draw from your life at all, or this one's totally
This
fiction?
is totally fiction. It's like very light. It's funny. It's fluffy.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know what your next book after that might be? Have you thought about that?
I have some immigrant horror stories that I have to write. And then I'm thinking I'll write some more like social satires about family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll never leave the topic of family. Who knows?
It's a pretty rich source.
Yeah.
I mean, even your
It's
description.
a curse, right?
Blessing and a curse? I
Yeah.
don't know. Even the neighborhood where you grew up, I don't know that most people know this side of Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
You live in, is it the Plateau?
Yeah.
It's in Coquitlam.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a hotbed of Chinese marijuana growing activity back in the day. And also like a place where people would get mauled by bears occasionally.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your neighborhood?
Well, so the neighborhood, it's sort of on a mountain. So it's kind of weird because you have like these really sort of McMansions and these, white picket fences. But then you have these trees, so you have bears coming around every day. So I remember like my mom and I getting groceries. We'll go in the driveway, get out, and there's a bear behind us. So you have to like either run or like fight it. So that's like my experience with Canada and bears. But usually they run away. Like that's what happens.
But at least one lady
Yeah.
you wrote had her head
Eaten.
attacked.
Yeah,
Eaten?
yeah.
Okay.
Because it like
were you being literal?
it was in the news.
Okay.
Yeah, it like the bear had gone into her basement and like attacked her,
Yeah.
and it was hungry, I think.
But this neighborhood, it was a place where all these Chinese families would buy the McMansions and start marijuana grow-ops and meth labs.
Yeah.
And your new neighbors would come around and bribe everybody with red pockets to buy your silence.
Yeah.
I feel like that's just like an HBO series
I
waiting to
know,
happen.
right?
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming all this way to Toronto and to the library to talk to us tonight. Maybe